It was a cold January morning in Washington, D.C. when Vice President JD Vance stepped out of the black SUV and onto the bustling streets near Capitol Hill. The air was filled with the usual noise of traffic, street vendors, and reporters huddled around in coats, clutching microphones and cameras. But this wasn't just another day. The country was still adjusting to the fact that Vance, a best-selling author turned senator, now sat a heartbeat away from the presidency. The invitations had gone out weeks before. JD Vance would appear live on the wildly popular Sunday morning political talk show Inside America. The show was notorious for its sharp questions, tough panelists, and most notably, its host, Evan Myers. Myers had built his career on cornering politicians, catching them off guard, and creating viral moments that dominated the internet for days. To some, he was a watchdog of democracy. To others, an arrogant provocateur. Vance knew what he was walking into. His team had warned him, Evan will come at you hard, especially with your Appalachian roots, your conservative populist views, and your stance on big tech and globalism. Yet, JD showed no sign of worry. In fact, he seemed calm, confident, almost too calm, his aides thought. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was electric. Bright lights, cameras, and a packed set of production staff hustling to get the angles just right. The network was hyping the segment as the face-off, Vance versus Myers. Social media was buzzing. Twitter trends, YouTube teasers, and Instagram reels were already speculating whether Vance would crumble or clap back. As Vance sat down, the audience behind the glass wall gave polite applause. Myers walked in seconds later, flashing his signature smirk, the one that hinted he already had his prey cornered. He was dressed sharply, flipping through notes and whispering last-minute instructions to the producers. Vice President Vance. Myers began smoothly, leaning back in his chair. Welcome to Inside America. Are you ready? JD gave a simple nod. Always. What followed was, at first, the usual political dance. Topics ranged from the economy to foreign policy, immigration, and the new education reform bill that the White House had just unveiled. Vance handled the questions firmly but respectfully. He articulated points, explained his positions, and refrained from partisanship. Viewers at home might have thought this would be just another routine interview. But Myers had other plans. He leaned forward suddenly, voice sharp. Mr. Vice President, many critics, and I'm quoting here, say you are a populist puppet. Evan, Vance said calmly, do you really think the people I grew up with in Middletown, Ohio, would consider me their puppet? Or is that just a narrative you folks in the studio prefer to tell yourselves? The studio shifted. Some gasped quietly. The control room lit up with chatter. Myers smirked again, but there was a flicker of unease. Vance wasn't done. You see, Evan, he continued, the people you call exploited? They're my family, my neighbors, my community. I didn't study them from a distance. I lived it. I climbed out of it. And unlike you, I didn't need a Manhattan cocktail party to teach me what real America looks like. The room froze. Even the cameramen looked up from their monitors. And that, dear viewers, was only the beginning. Myers quickly adjusted his tie, concealing the surprise in his eyes with a chuckle. Oh, I see, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. So, you're saying you're the only one who understands the so-called real America? That sounds more like a campaign slogan than an answer. JD leaned back, folded his arms, and gave a slight smile, the kind that didn't need words to make an impact. No, Evan. I'm saying I don't pretend to understand it. I've lived it. There's a difference. The studio was eerily quiet now, as if the walls themselves were listening. Myers pressed on, hoping to regain control. But you stand here as the second most powerful man in the country. Surely you can't claim to still be part of that working class you so often reference. Vance's reply was instantaneous. Evan, when I go home for Christmas, I don't walk into a penthouse. I walk into my mother's small house on the edge of Middletown with a leaky roof and neighbors who still worry about paying for insulin. No title changes where you come from. I may be the Vice President of the United States, but I'm still JD, the boy who used to split a frozen pizza 4 ways with his cousins because it was all we had. Gasps swept through the control room and the live audience behind the glass. Even viewers watching from home could feel the chill in the air as Vance's words settled. Myers, visibly rattled, tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. All right, fair enough. Then let's talk about your policies. Some argue that your administration's stance on trade and big tech regulation is reckless. You're risking the free market under the guise of protecting small-town America. JD chuckled softly. Is it reckless to make sure that the small businesses in Zanesville, Ohio aren't crushed under the boot of trillion-dollar tech monopolies? Is it reckless to demand that billion-dollar hedge funds don't strip-mine communities for short-term profit? Myers' lips tightened. He wasn't used to this. Politicians typically stumbled or dodged. JD wasn't stumbling, he was walking straight through. JD continued, you know, Evan, folks like you love to worship the free market. But what you're really defending is a market rigged in favor of the most powerful, the most connected. The free market isn't free if it leaves half the country hopeless. The studio crackled with tension. Even Myers' seasoned producers began exchanging glances behind the glass. Vance's voice took on a personal note. I watched my mother lose jobs because factories closed. I saw neighbors turn to opioids because Wall Street took the only jobs they ever knew and shipped them overseas. And I'm supposed to sit here and apologize for trying to fix that? Not happening. The silence that followed was unbearable. Myers shuffled his notes but couldn't seem to find the next card. The cameras zoomed in on Vance, who remained composed yet fiery. Finally, Myers attempted to regain his signature condescending tone. Mr. Vice President, some say your policies are emotionally driven, perhaps even naive, considering the global economic landscape. JD raised an eyebrow. Emotionally driven? Evan, tell me, what's more naive? Thinking that communities like mine will survive another decade of decline without help, or believing that more panel discussions in Georgetown will fix it? The control room fell completely silent. One of the producers whispered, we need to go to commercial. But Myers waved them off. He wasn't ready to give up. Yet deep down everyone sensed it, Vance wasn't the one on the ropes. He was just getting warmed up, the cameras kept rolling. No commercial break. No softening. Myers, despite the pounding in his chest, decided to go for the knockout. He had built his reputation on pulling out one last, devastating question, the one that would corner a guest beyond recovery. Mr. Vice President, Myers said, leaning forward with narrowed eyes, many of your critics say you're playing victim politics. That you are capitalizing on your upbringing to justify policies that could destabilize America's position globally. Isn't this just a personal crusade disguised as governance? JD took a long pause, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he knew this was the moment. The entire studio was hanging on his next words. He adjusted his cufflinks, locked eyes with Myers, and spoke slowly, deliberately. Evan, let me explain something to you, and I hope you'll really listen. You think this is about me? You think I'm here whining about my childhood or weaponizing hardship? You don't get it. This isn't about my story. It's about millions of stories. People across America, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, and yes, even parts of your precious New York City who've been left behind, ignored, and mocked by people who sip lattes and make TikToks about how ignorant flyover country is. JD's voice grew stronger with each word. The crowd watching through the glass was visibly captivated. Even Myers' staff stared at the monitors, speechless. This is bigger than me, Evan, JD said, his tone fierce but steady. It's about kids who still watch their parents cry at the kitchen table over bills. It's about parents who can't get their kids into a decent school because we've allowed the system to rot from the inside out while billionaires double their wealth during a pandemic. And you think it's a personal crusade because I refuse to speak about it like a think tank analyst instead of a human being. The words hit like a freight train. Myers blinked, caught off guard, but tried to push again. Button. JD raised a finger, stopping him cold. Evan, you sit here in the studio and talk about stability like it's some sacred cow. Stability for who? Wall Street? Silicon Valley? The defense contractors? What about the parents who've buried their kids because no one lifted a finger while opioids flooded their towns? What about the factory workers who showed up every day for 30 years only to be told by some guy in a suit that their job was gone because it was more efficient to move it to another continent? JD's voice softened for a brief moment, which made it even more powerful. You call it victim politics. I call it finally telling the truth. You could hear a pin drop. Myers, usually quick with a rebuttal, sat frozen, unable to pivot. His notes, once a weapon, now looked like a pile of meaningless paper in front of him. From behind the camera glass, a producer whispered to another, he's schooling him. Vance continued, I didn't come here to play games or win a debate. I came here because there's a kid right now somewhere, in Ohio, Kentucky, maybe even here in DC, watching the show, wondering if anyone in this town gives a damn about them. Well, kid, I do. There was no applause yet. No clapping. Just stunned silence. Even Evan Myers, known for always having the last word, was staring blankly, unable to formulate a comeback. JD calmly adjusted his mic and sat back. "You wanted answers, Evan? You just got one." The cameras, still rolling, captured the stunned faces across the studio. And JD? JD just sat there, stoic, knowing full well the internet was about to explode. The crew scrambled behind the scenes. Stage managers whispered urgently into headsets, producers waved frantically from the control booth, but no one could quite break the tension in the room. It wasn't just an interview anymore, it was a moment. One of those rare, unscripted, viral before it's over moments. Evan Myers shifted in his seat, adjusting his earpiece. For once, he wasn't playing to the cameras. He was cornered. His usual tactic of patronizing smirks and rhetorical traps had failed. Worse, it had backfired. The vice president had just done what no one in modern political media seemed capable of. He spoke with the weight of experience, not talking points. JD sat still, eyes locked on Myers, unfazed. The silence wasn't awkward for him. He had grown up in homes filled with silence, the kind where there wasn't enough food or hope to talk about. After what felt like an eternity, Myers coughed lightly. "Vice President Vance, well, you seem passionate, but you have to admit this is complicated. Global economics, foreign affairs, it's not as simple as standing up for the little guy. You risk alienating allies, disrupting supply chains, even inviting economic downturns." JD gave a small nod, acknowledging the fair point without conceding. His reply, however, was sharper than anyone expected. "Evan, you mistake complicated for impossible. What's complicated is keeping the status quo while pretending it serves everyone. What's hard is standing up to people who fund half the institutions that broadcast this very show. What's difficult is telling the lobbyists and consultants that the gravy train is over." The audience behind the glass perked up, some even exchanged smiles. The producers, sensing the mood shift, could hardly believe what they were watching. JD wasn't just defending himself. He was flipping the entire premise of the show on its head. "Let me tell you about complicated," JD continued. "Try explaining to a single mother in Dayton why a college degree now costs $100,000, but her son can't even get a factory job without a certification invented last year by someone in Washington. Try explaining why small towns pay the price every time DC wants to score points on the world stage. That's complicated. Yet, they still get up every morning and fight for their families." Myers' lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out. JD leaned forward. "I don't expect perfection, Evan. But what I refuse to accept is surrender. And that's what this town has done for decades, surrendered. To corporations. To foreign competitors. To anyone with enough money to write the rules." Suddenly, the studio's silence was broken, not by Myers but by the faintest murmur of applause from the production staff themselves. A cameraman quickly lowered his head, realizing he was clapping instinctively. JD caught it. "I'm not here to score points, Evan. I don't need your approval or the approval of anyone on this coast. I need working Americans to know someone is still fighting for them." And then came the unexpected. Evan Myers, the man who had filleted senators, governors, and presidential candidates on live television for 2 decades, leaned back, visibly speechless. His eyes darted to the producers for help, but none came. No cue cards, no fed lines, no whispered lifeline from the control room. JD Vance had done what nobody thought possible. He had silenced Evan Myers. And not with outrage. Not with anger. With truth. As the cameras continued rolling, the control room faced a dilemma. This wasn't going to be edited out. This wasn't going to be spun. This was already out there. The audience watching live knew it. And JD? JD knew it too. His next words were even softer, but they hit harder than anything yet. "I don't mind the hard questions, Evan. I mind when we stop listening to the people who can't afford to be in this studio to ask them." And then he folded his hands quietly on the desk. The studio was still. Frozen. Gripped. And for once, Evan Myers had nothing left to say. The credits hadn't even rolled before the clip went viral. Within minutes, social media platforms were flooded with hashtags, #Vance silences Myers, #RealTalk, and #JD2028 trended globally. Across the nation, living rooms, cafes, and even airports replayed the clip on loop. People weren't just watching an interview, they were witnessing a cultural shift. Inside the studio, the staff stood motionless. Some glanced nervously at Myers, who sat slouched, visibly deflated. The sharp-tongued interrogator, the so-called lion of cable news, had been reduced to stunned silence, not by scandal, not by some sensational slip, but by something rarer, sincerity. As JD calmly unhooked his lapel mic, Myers managed a weak smile. Well, he muttered, I guess you've given the folks at home something to talk about. JD simply replied, that was the point, Evan. JD's Secret Service detail was already waiting at the studio exit, but Vance took his time. He chatted briefly with the young sound technician who had adjusted his mic earlier. He shook hands with the janitor sweeping the hallway. He even posed for a selfie with a young intern who confessed, Sir, you're going to break the internet today. Outside, the cold January wind hit his face, but JD barely noticed. Reporters clustered outside, cameras ready, yelling questions about the viral moment. Mr. Vice President, did you mean to humiliate Evan Myers? Was that scripted? Did you know it would go viral? Vance stopped for a second, looked right at them, and with that same calm presence said, I didn't humiliate anyone. I just told the truth. Sometimes the truth is hard to hear. And with that, he climbed into the black SUV and disappeared into the DC streets. The response was electric. In Youngstown, factory workers gathered around break-room TVs replaying the interview. In Louisville, truckers on CB radios were buzzing, you hear what JD said to Myers? Man finally said what we've all been thinking. Even in parts of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, where Vance was often painted as too rustic or too populist, people found themselves nodding along. Major news networks scrambled to spin the story. Some anchors tried to downplay it as political theater, while others grudgingly admitted it was a masterclass in authentic communication. Online commentators across the political spectrum posted reaction videos titled Vance Just Ended Evan Myers, the interview that changed the game, and why JD Vance just became the most powerful voice in America. Within 48 hours, the clip had over 70 million views online. JD's office, flooded with emails, texts, and calls, could hardly keep up. Veterans, farmers, teachers, factory workers, nurses, everyday Americans were reaching out not just with praise, but with gratitude. They finally felt like someone sitting near the Resolute desk understood them. President Henderson, watching from the Oval Office with his chief of staff, chuckled. That boy just went from vice president to future president, he said under his breath. JD, however, wasn't celebrating. He wasn't posting victory tweets or smiling for cameras. He returned to work like it was any other day. As he told his inner circle, this isn't about me winning a soundbite. It's about making sure those people out there, the ones Evan calls forgotten, know they've got a seat at the table. And perhaps most astonishing, in the days following the interview, Evan Myers himself, known for never apologizing, opened his next show with a rare admission. I underestimated Vice President Vance, Myers said to his viewers, staring directly into the camera. And if we're being honest, maybe we've all underestimated the people he's fighting for. The studio audience clapped softly. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't politics as usual. It wasn't just another headline. It was a wake-up call. And JD Vance? He didn't just silence a journalist. He woke up a nation.